Let's ask him what that was like. Eylon Levy is a co-founder of Israeli Citizen. He's spokesperson's office and former Israeli government spokesman, joining me now. Good to have you. I think you're in Toronto today, correct?
Hello, Alex. Good to join you from Toronto.
All right. Was the greeting friendlier here? Because while you couldn't hear the chants of Alec Bar in that, I mean, what was that like for you to actually be greeted like that? It's not your first time in Canada, obviously, but what was that like?
No, not my first time in Canada, and I was told Canadians are nice and warm and friendly, and I didn't know Allahu Akbar is a traditional Canadian welcome, but there you have it.
All the rage these days, yes.
All the rage. I really hope that listeners understand that this isn't a political protest. Once you're crying Allahu Akbar, these are full-on jihadi war cries. And there is a problem in Canada, a domestic extremist problem that is being fueled by, as you called it, the terrorist propaganda against Israel. And this is a real threat. It's a real threat not only to us in Israel as we fight for our lives on 7 fronts and fight to bring back the hostages, but it's a fight for the well-being of Canadian society as well. And whether we want colleges to be places where students can study in peace and get on with their lives, or whether speakers are going to be harassed with cries of Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And I can say from my social media, I've been inundated with messages from Canadians saying, I'm horrified, this isn't my country, and I recognize this has to change.
Yeah, I'm horrified too, but it is my country, sadly, because you can't ignore it. For the last, year and a bit, every single weekend and sometimes throughout the week, we've had these really horrific, protests under the guise of, charter rights to protest. And whether you're in Quebec, in Montreal, or in Toronto, or in places in Alberta or Vancouver, you've got these very extremist groups coming out and protesting and taking the streets. It's very clear that anti-Semitism is alive and well in this country. You just barely need to scratch the surface. And so what does that tell you as someone coming from the outside looking in, and given your way of living in Israel, knowing that you're kind of always on the most wanted list? But what is it? What would your message be to this country?
It's really scary for the Jewish community here. It's horrifying to hear Jewish citizens of Canada talking about whether this country will continue to be a warm and inclusive home for them in a generation, because they're seeing what the other side are chanting in these protests. When they call globalize the Intifada, what does that mean? The Intifada was a wave of suicide bombings against Israelis in the 2000s. When Canadians are crying, globalize the Intifada, they're calling for more terrorism. When they chant from the river to the sea, that's a call for the destruction of the state of Israel. And that's leaving a lot of Canadian Jews feeling very isolated and feeling that they're standing up not only for themselves, but standing up for Canada as well by standing up against this extremism. Israel now finds itself fighting for its life on 7 fronts. Mm-hmm. We often talk as if this is a war just against Hamas, the terrorist army that perpetrated the October 7th massacre. But every day, Israel is under attack from 4 or 5 different directions. We have rocket and drone attacks from Hezbollah in the north, from the Houthis in Yemen, from Palestinian terrorists, Iranian militias in Syria, Iraq, and from the Iranian regime itself, which has targeted Israel with the biggest ballistic missile attacks in history. And right now, as we speak, is threatening to do it all over again. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason that I'm here in Canada is to try to drum up support among the Canadian public for Canada's ally Israel and say, hold firm, we need you with us because we're fighting your fight.
Yeah, well, Iran, we have a lot of proxies here. We've got, local affiliates here. We've got groups that work under Iran, sowing the seeds of hate. And groups like Samaduan have just been listed as a terror entity, something that should have happened a long time ago. The bottom line is these groups have been very, very successful with propaganda and basically rewriting a lot of the narrative to what we have seen. That's not to suggest that Israel doesn't do anything wrong or that you can't criticize Israel, but certainly when it comes to the message campaign, Israel's had a very difficult time, getting any message across. Why is that?
I think there are many reasons. And I think part of the reason is Hamas's strategy in this war. Let's understand what Hamas is trying to achieve. On October 7th last year, it brutally slaughtered 1,200 people in their homes and a music festival. It took 250 hostages, including Canadian citizens. And it lured Israel into an urban counter-terror battle. Now it had prepared Gaza for this. It had rigged the battlefield. Mm-hmm. They dug a tunnel network longer than the New York subway under homes and schools and mosques and hospitals because Hamas's strategy was to generate suffering. They wanted to generate suffering so that the world would pressure Israel to stop this war with Hamas still in power and hostages inside Gaza. And Israel's strategy has been to get civilians out of harm's way time and time again, even as the terrorists keep trying to move along with them. But Hamas knows exactly what it is doing. Hamas's strategy is to try to create suffering in Gaza in the hope that the world will blame Israel. They will blame Israel for fighting to free the hostages and bring Hamas to justice, instead of blaming the jihadi psychopaths who launched this war in the first place and are fighting it from out of schools and hospitals. And unfortunately, that has been a very successful strategy in manipulating people's emotions and getting them to think emotionally rather than seriously and rationally about how Israel is supposed to deal with these genuinely genocidal threats on its borders from the Iranian regime and terrorist armies that have sworn to its destruction.
Then they've been very successful at it. Since this happened on October 7th, we've seen it it's been ripping apart our political landscape. But even as soon as this weekend, the NDP, our federal, socialist party, they have now said no, they will not adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. So that is, I think, as close to what Israel would accept as the bar to be set. And we've got governments here and politicians that won't even accept what has been laid out as, the important of what they consider, anti-Semitism. And so the NDP are saying, yeah, no, thanks, we're not even going to accept that. And that's what you're up against.
Alex, Israel, it's so much worse than that. It's so much worse than that. And I'll point out a way that Canada, with the best of intentions, is actually making this conflict worse. Take the question of UNRWA. Yep. UNRWA is the Palestinians' own refugee agency. There's a refugee agency that deals with everyone else in the world, but the Palestinians have their own agency. And its job is not to resettle them. It's to keep them as refugees generation after generation. UNRWA staff took part in the October 7th massacre. UNRWA staff took part in the October 7th massacre. UNRWA let Hamas fighters fight out of its own schools. And here's the most horrifying thing. You know how we hear politicians saying we need to give money to UNRWA because it provides an education for Gaza's children? It's therefore a fact that most of the terrorists who took part in October 7th went to Canadian taxpayer-funded schools. And I think that's a shocking indictment of Canadian foreign policy, that the Canadian governments have taken Canadian taxpayer dollars and are spending them on the schools that produced the October 7th terrorists. And that needs to change, because if we want to move to a future of peace in the region, we need the Palestinians to accept that Israel is here to stay and to try to make peace with it, instead of using Canadian taxpayer dollars to continue to indoctrinate children to idolize jihad and martyrdom.
Yeah, we are an outlier on that. Our allies are not funding this organization. Why we are is so beyond me. It's appalling. Before I run out of time with you, I'm sure you're following the American election. We will have elections here in this country at some point, and could be looking at probably at a change of leadership. But how important is this, and I'm not going to ask you who to vote for. You're free to offer that if you want, but it's rude to ask someone who they're voting for. But how important is this election to the future of Israel and certainly whomever wins?
Israel is an ally of the United States, and the United States is our biggest supporter. That means that whoever is in the White House will have a critical impact on our security, on our ability to fight against enemies attacking us on 7 fronts. I don't envy people who have to make a decision in this election. There are complicated dilemmas, but let's wait and see who wins. Wish both candidates best of luck and see how we deal with it from there.
Yeah, well, we will see. Certainly, there are different candidates and lots of debate as to who to support, but there will be implications, no question about it. I very much appreciate your time joining us. I know that you're in demand, and I'm happy you could make some time for us.
Anytime for you.
Thank you. That is Eylon Levy. He's the co-founder of the Israeli Citizen Spokesperson's Office, also a former Israeli government spokesperson, and certainly been here in Canada a couple of times.